Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going methodically unpack a highly detailed data-backed dossier that really dissects the Watchtower's totalistic compliance infrastructure. Now, we're deliberately stepping away from the theological debates here to look purely at the clinical, organizational, and historical facts. What we're digging into is a comprehensive, independent report that details exactly how a modern, high-control organization operates, regulates its members, and completely insulates itself from outside scrutiny. Let's get started. Here's our roadmap for this investigation. 1. The bureaucratic hierarchy. 2. The bite model and thought reform. 3. The hidden archives. And finally, 4. The Mirage of Prophecy.
All right, part 1, the bureaucratic hierarchy.
So, to really understand how this organization functions today, we kind of have to trace how a 19th century religious movement transformed into a highly centralized corporation. Back in the 1870s, Charles Taze Russell founded the Bible student movement, and it was actually a relatively decentralized return to what he viewed as primitive Christianity. But following his death in 1916, there was a dramatic shift. Joseph Franklin Rutherford basically seized control of the Watchtower Society. He engineered an aggressive purge of dissidents and intensely centralized all authority. He adopted the name Jehovah's Witnesses in 1931 and essentially established the rigid governing body committee that rules the organization today.
And it's wild when you consider the sheer scale of the operation that grew out of Rutherford's centralization. Today, the organization oversees approximately 9.2 million active publishers. Those members are spread across more than 119,500 congregations in over 240 countries and territories. And every single bit of that is managed meticulously from their central headquarters in Warwick, New York.
Now, sustaining an empire of that size requires a sophisticated and, frankly, highly opaque financial infrastructure. Beyond an estimated $20 billion global real estate empire, there's the recent August 2024 creation of 3 new financial entities based in Ireland: Mina Asset Management, Mina Treasury Services, and Lepta Payment Solutions. This strongly points to a complex international asset management strategy. And here's the kicker: it operates with a distinct corporate advantage. The whole thing relies completely on an unpaid volunteer labor force for literally everything, from global construction to legal administration.
Moving on to part 2, the bite model and thought reform. Let's shift our focus away from the corporate facade and look at the internal reality for members. Scholars often rely on clinical psychological frameworks to understand how this level of strict obedience is maintained. Specifically, Robert Lifton's criteria for thought reform and Stephen Hassan's bite model. These are clinical lenses used to analyze how high control groups systematically suppress individual conscience. The mechanism here is externalizing personal autonomy, meaning you outsource your decision-making to a central committee. That process strips away interior awareness. It creates this inescapable elder salvation trap, where your very right to exist within the community absolutely depends on total compliance. It's fascinating because this academic model maps perfectly onto the everyday practices of Jehovah's Witnesses. The bite model stands for behavior, information, thought, and emotional control. Under behavior, we see extreme dictates, like the absolute ban on blood transfusions, which literally dictates medical survival. Information is strictly restricted by forbidding members from reading any critical or apostate material. Thought is regulated through loaded language, using terms like the truth or worldly people to force reality into binary terms. And finally, emotion is controlled through this pervasive, existential fear of being destroyed at Armageddon if you step out of line. It's a system of clinical control over every single aspect of a person's reality. All of this relentless emotional control ultimately leads to what Robert Lifton calls the dispensing of existence. For Jehovah's Witnesses, that manifests as the devastating practice of mandatory family shunning, commonly known as disfellowshipping. If a member breaks the rules or even just doubts the governing body, they are entirely cut off from their family and friends. This policy is so severe that it recently sparked a fierce legal battle over the group's deregistration in Norway. Now, in 2024, facing intense international pressure, the organization introduced what critics are calling cosmetic policy updates, basically allowing a simple greeting to some shunned members. But the core mechanism hasn't changed. Independent research documents severe mental health impacts from this, including high rates of PTSD, depression, and religious trauma syndrome among former members.
Let's dive into part 3, the hidden archives.
So what happens when absolute compliance collides with institutional self-preservation? Well, the real-world consequences are devastating. We can clearly see this in the organization's internal judicial system, specifically their use of the two-witness rule. Based on a very rigid interpretation of Deuteronomy 19:15, congregation elders historically refused to discipline an accused child abuser without a second corroborating eyewitness or a confession. Because abuse is inherently secretive, you almost never have a second witness. So this inflexible doctrine effectively became the foundational shield for a global systemic cover-up, protecting perpetrators while totally silencing victims.
When you lay this crisis out chronologically, the scale of it is staggering. Think of these dates and figures as exhibit evidence. In 1997, the organization issued a directive that established a secret database of accused abusers. Fast forward to 2015, the Australian Royal Commission exposed that the organization held files on 1,006 alleged perpetrators in Australia alone, and not a single one was reported to secular authorities. By 2018, there was a massive $35 million jury verdict in Montana over a covered-up abuse case. And jumping right to 2025, an ongoing Pennsylvania grand jury has resulted in 17 members being criminally charged. It's a timeline that starkly illustrates an institution repeatedly prioritizing its public reputation over the safety of its most vulnerable members.
To really grasp the institutional mindset here, you just have to look at their internal directives. Elders were explicitly instructed to report abuse claims directly to Watchtower headquarters via a special designated process. This deliberately bypassed law enforcement. They were further commanded never to share these letters with outsiders. The solemnity of those instructions really speaks for itself, doesn't it? It's a documented act of obstruction of civil justice, meticulously coordinated to keep those archives hidden.
And that brings us to part 4, the Mirage of Prophecy.
You might be asking yourself, how does the leadership justify all of this authoritarian control and secrecy? The answer lies in their foundational claim to exclusive divine foresight. Yet historically, we see a recurring pattern of apocalyptic mirages. In 1874, they predicted Christ's invisible return. In 1914, Armageddon was supposed to begin. 1925 was meant to bring the literal resurrection of biblical princes. And 1975 was heavily promoted as the end of 6,000 years of human history, which actually led many members to sell their homes and forgo education. But in every single instance, the promised end of the world simply failed to materialize.
But what's perhaps most telling isn't the failed predictions, it's how the organization handles those failures. Following the massive disappointment of 1975, instead of taking any institutional accountability for their prophetic miscalculations, the leadership engaged in doctrinal revision. They actually published statements subtly blaming their own members for over-anticipating the date. This staggering lack of accountability caused hundreds of thousands of people to leave the faith in the late 1970s. It perfectly encapsulates a system where the leadership claims all the divine authority but accepts absolutely none of the institutional responsibility.
We're going to wrap up this explainer with a final, pretty provocative question that this entire dossier forces us to consider. Think about the data we've covered, the billions in opaque assets, the clinical thought reform, the shattered families, the hidden archives of abuse, and the endless mirage of failed prophecies. You really have to ask yourself, what is the true human cost of outsourcing your personal autonomy and interior awareness to a high-control committee? When salvation is trapped behind a wall of totalistic compliance, what actually remains of individual humanity? Think about that for a while. Thanks for joining me as we unpack the source material today.